Okay, my name is Kelsey Jones or Knowles, and this is my coworker Alize. And today I'm going to tell her the story of the Bible. Okay, so to give you an outline of how we're going to talk about it today, I know you're not super familiar with the Bible, but you do know that there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. And I'm going to split those testaments into subcategories. So there are 66 books in the whole Bible. And there's many different authors, and there are a lot of different literary styles. So there's books that focus more on history, there's books that focus on more poetic type works of art. And what I'm going to do today is tell you the story from start to finish of the whole narrative of the whole Bible put together. So the way I'm going to chop it up is, starting in the Old Testament, we have a few different sections. So we start with the first 5 books of the Old Testament called the Pentateuch. And then we're going to move into 12 books that are history books. So we're going to talk about the history of what God is doing in the Bible. And then we're going to talk a little bit about poetry. And then we're going to talk about the prophets. And there are 5 major prophets, and there are 12 minor prophets. So those prophets will have various roles depending on what part of the story they take place. And we're going to put those in their right place in the story. The only difference between a major and a minor prophet is the size of the book, but we'll talk about all that. So that's what we're going to do with the Old Testament. And then with the New Testament, we're going to start out with the 4 Gospels. So those are the story of Jesus, the good news of Jesus. Then we're going to move into 1 book of history, and then there are 21 letters that are in the New Testament. And then we'll end with the 1 prophetic book in the New Testament called Revelation. So that's the whole sort of outline of the Bible, and I'm just going to walk you through the story start to finish. So the Bible opens up in Genesis, and you see Creator God, one God, creates the whole universe. And he does this in 6 days. He rests on the 7th, and he says as he creates that everything he creates is good. And when he creates mankind on the 7th day, he says it's very good. So right then and there, you see that there's sort of a special relationship between God and mankind. God places man in the Garden of Eden, and he creates woman from Adam's rib. And during this time in the Garden of Eden, he walks with Adam and Eve, he talks with Adam and Eve, he has a really personal relationship with them. So everything is peaceful, perfect peace, or shalom. So they're walking, they're talking in the Garden of Eden. He gives them 1 rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, enter Satan in the form of a serpent, and he approaches Eve in the garden and tempts her and says, God is not telling you the truth. He twists what God says, and he essentially gets her to eat from that tree. So she takes a bite of that apple, or whatever fruit it was, and she ends up passing it on to Adam, who also takes a bite. So in this moment, you see sin enter the world for the first time. They've disobeyed God, and that's a big problem. So in that moment, they recognize that they're naked. So when you have sin, you have exposure. And when you have exposure, you must cover up. So they recognize that they're naked. And a really interesting part here is that an animal must be killed to cover them with their skin. So when you have sin, you have death. So God comes and finds Adam and Eve and says, what happened? They play a quick blame game, but God ends up judging all of them. And the coolest thing here is when he does this judgment, and there are consequences to sin, and man and woman and the serpent each find their own consequences, God gives us hope. So in this moment, he says to the serpent, you're going to be on your belly for the rest of time. So at this time, he must have been standing up in some way, curses the serpent to his belly, and then tells them that there will be a seed of man in the future, and the serpent will bruise the seed of man's heel, but the seed of man will crush the serpent's head. So in that, we get a picture of future hope, where there will be great pain caused to the man, but the man will ultimately defeat the serpent by stomping on his head. So in mankind's darkest moment, God provides hope, and we'll come back and kind of tie that through the rest of the story as we keep going. So sin enters the world, and it permeates everything. So everything breaks down, and you see this throughout the book of Genesis. And the next big thing I'll talk about is the Great Flood, and you might be familiar with it, I'm not sure. But essentially, mankind gets so wicked throughout the rest of Genesis that God decides that he must destroy everyone. But one man finds favor in his eyes for being righteous, meaning he honors God, and his name is Noah. So God has Noah build an ark, a big boat, and he brings his family inside the ark, and then 2 of each animal. And God sends massive floodwaters to the earth for 40 days and 40 nights and destroys the rest of mankind. The floodwaters cease. Noah exits the ark with all of the animals, and God sends a rainbow to promise that he'll never destroy mankind in this way again, which is still something really cool that we get to see today. So the world kind of rebuilds itself. They produce. They have a bunch of kids. They produce. And you see another really interesting story with the Tower of Babel, just to, again, touch on how sin impacted everything. The Tower of Babel was a scenario in which the people come together and decide that they want to be like God. So they decide to build a tower to heaven. And because of this, God says, nope, not happening. I'm going to confuse your languages, and so that you can't communicate with one another and continue building this tower. So that's the first time we see languages dispersed. So all these people can't understand each other anymore, so they can no longer build this tower all the way to heaven. Okay, so moving through Genesis, now you've seen that sin is a problem. Sin permeated everything, and people continually disobey or hurt the heart of God. Enter the man called Abraham, and we've talked about him before, but God finds him faithful and righteous in his own eyes. So God actually sends a promise to Abraham, and it's a covenant, and it's an unconditional covenant, meaning that Abraham has to do nothing on his end for this covenant to be upheld. So God says, hey, Abraham, even in your old age and in your wife's old age, I'm going to bless you with kids. They didn't have any kids at this time, so that you will have a people. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. There will be a great people. They will live in a land, a prosperous land, and they will be a blessing to the rest of the earth. So that's a huge promise, and eventually Abraham and his wife do have a son. His name's Isaac, and then Isaac has a son named Jacob, and Jacob has a son named Joseph. He has many sons. So quickly scooting through the rest of the story of Genesis, we have a huge promise here that we're also going to touch on throughout the rest of the story. Joseph was his father's favorite son of the 12. The other 11 sons get really, really jealous. So they end up selling Joseph into slavery. Joseph ends up in Egypt, and through a series of events, ends up in prison. While in prison, he ends up interpreting some dreams for some other people in the prison, and they get released. Well, one of them does, and Joseph says, please remember me, because he'd been wrongfully accused, and when you get out. So they end up getting out, and eventually they do remember Joseph. So Joseph is called to actually interpret a dream for the Pharaoh, or the king of Egypt. When he does this, and he does it successfully, Pharaoh ends up making Joseph his right-hand man. So there ends up being a great famine in all the land, and meaning no food, no water, nothing's growing, no crops. And Joseph, because of his relationship with the Lord and his foresight, saw this coming and has been storing grain in Egypt for years and years so that the people have enough to eat, even in this sort of dry spell. So what ends up happening is Joseph's family, who's still in the land that God sent Abraham to, remember it's part of Abraham's descendants, his whole family is still in that land, and they don't have any food because of this famine. So they end up hearing about all the food in Egypt and going to Egypt to get food. Well, Joseph recognizes the family. They don't recognize him. And there ends up being a really cool story of redemption and forgiveness where Joseph forgives them and sees that God has worked everything for good. Had they not sold him off, there wouldn't have been a place in Egypt with all this extra food. So really cool story of redemption. So now you have sin entered the world. God made Abraham a promise, land, people, and blessing. And you have these growing group of people in Egypt. So that's how the book of Genesis ends. Book of Exodus. It opens up, and this massive group of people that are now in Egypt have grown exponentially. So a lot of them. And the Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh, doesn't remember Joseph and the favor that he had in Egypt. And he gets nervous. There's a huge group of people. He's worried they're going to revolt, so he enslaves them. He oppresses them, and he actually says, kill all the baby boys. We don't want this people growing at all. One of the Israelite women, they're the people that Abraham led to his land, are called the Israelites. And one of those Israelite women said, I'm going to have my baby, and I'm going to hide the baby. Long story short, the baby gets taken by Pharaoh's daughter and grows up in Pharaoh's household. She has mercy on this Hebrew baby. His name is Moses. And Moses grows up. He's a Hebrew, or an Israelite, or a Jew, a lot of different words for it. And but he grows up in Pharaoh's household. So he's not necessarily full Hebrew, and he's not necessarily full Egyptian. He has a hard time finding his place. He ends up killing an Egyptian man and has to flee. God comes down while he's in the desert, he's fled, and meets him in a burning bush and says, I've heard the groans of my people in Egypt. They're all enslaved. I want you to go back, and I'm going to work through you to free my people from Egypt and take them to the land that I promised Abraham. So Moses goes back, and through a series of plagues, God shows himself to be the one true God. So he individually defeats the gods of the Egyptian people at the time and proves himself over and over again that he is the one true God. And the last plague, it's now referred to as Passover, and it's still something that the Jewish people celebrate today. God told the Israelite people, kill a lamb, a perfect lamb, and put its blood over the door. And if you do so, if you do this action, therefore representing that you believe me, I will pass over your house. But if you don't, I'm going to kill the firstborn in your household. Well, all the Israelites do that. None of their people die, but Pharaoh's firstborn, along with all the Egyptians' firstborn males, die. So finally, Pharaoh says, Moses, take the people, get them out of here. So the Israelite people leave Egypt. The Egyptian people end up chasing the Israelites, and God parts the Red Sea miraculously so that the Israelite people can cross. As soon as the Israelite people cross, the waters come down over the Egyptians, and they all die. But God has redeemed his people and saved them from the slavery just like he promised. So now you have a people in the desert without a law and without a land. So you have the Hebrew people, going back to the promise of Abraham, wandering around in the desert on the way to the promised land, now known as Israel. So God in Exodus, the rest of Exodus, is him giving his law to his people. So the 10 Commandments and a bunch of other laws, God comes down and says, and writes them on tablets and says, here's the laws that I want you to obey, and this will mark you as my people. And I want to be in relationship with you through these laws. So enter Leviticus, and I'm going to touch on this one quickly. That is an entire book of the Bible dedicated to the sacrificial law. So because man is sinful and they cannot uphold these laws perfectly, no man is perfect, sin has permeated everything, there are sacrificial laws that must be followed by certain people in the Israelite community in order to become right with God again. So that's the book of Leviticus, long book on that. And then Deuteronomy. So the next book is the people are in the desert. They've now got the law. Numbers is the next book. So they're in the land. They have a law. And now they're approaching the promised land that God was sending them to. They send 12 spies into the land to check it out and see how they're going to approach it and defeat it. And 10 of the spies come back and say, the people are giants and we have no chance. 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, come and say, God told us to go, he's going to be faithful, and he's going to help us defeat this people. Well, the entire nation decides, we're not going, that sounds scary. Well, God, because of their disobedience, says, okay, none of you get to enter the land except for these 2 of this generation. So you're going to wander the desert for 40 years while you all die off, and I'm going to raise up the next generation to enter the land. So Numbers has 2 censuses. The first census is God and Israel taking account of the number of people in that first generation, and then 40 years of wandering, and then the second census is taking account of the people that God has risen up in the second generation that will actually get to enter the land. So Deuteronomy comes around, and you have a new generation of people, And so God re-reveals his law to this new generation of people. So it looks pretty similar to Exodus. One really key thing here is in Deuteronomy 28, there's what we call the Mosaic covenant. So whereas the Abrahamic covenant was unconditional, Abraham didn't have to do anything, the Mosaic covenant is God saying, if you obey these laws, you will be blessed with crops and children, prosperity and blessing. If you disobey these laws, you will be cursed in the opposite way. You will not have crops and you will not have kids. And this is really important to understanding the rest of the Old Testament. So as he re-reveals his law, he makes this covenant with his people. If you obey me, you'll be blessed. If you disobey, you won't be. Okay, so that concludes the first 5 books of the Bible known as the Pentateuch. We're going to move now into 12 books, and these are going to be way more summarized of history of the Israelite people. And this is really interesting. So you have a new group of people with a law, and now they're ready to enter the land. So in the book of Joshua, you have a new leader. Moses has died, and Joshua, one of those 12 spies that was faithful to God, leads the people into the promised land. They finally conquest it. They get the land. They win it. And so now, going back to the Abrahamic covenant, you have God's people in a land with a law. So he's fulfilling all of his promises that he's made to Abraham. So moving on to the next book, Judges. The people need some sort of system, some sort of political governing system. Well, God is to be their king, and so God sets up what he calls judges. So they're sort of like military leaders, but they're to decide and help lead the people in the laws of the land. Well, a really interesting cycle happens in Judges, and it's directly related to that Mosaic covenant. So in Judges, you have these leaders, and some of the leaders are great and some aren't so great, but essentially you have the people who they obey the Lord, they obey his commands, they obey the Mosaic covenant, and therefore they're blessed. Then they might get lazy and they start disobeying the covenant, and so they get cursed. They end up repenting, they obey, they get blessed. So you go on this cycle over and over again. You see it in Judges, and it's directly playing out what God promised in the Mosaic covenant. In this time, you also have a quick story on the book of Ruth. Ruth is a woman who's not a Jewish woman. She's a Moabite. A Jewish family goes into their land, the Moab land, in famine, which was part of that cycle when there was curse in the land of Israel because of disobedience. There's famine. So during one of those famines, a Jewish family goes into Moab, and that family intermarries with that people. All the men die. And this woman, Ruth, looks at her mother-in-law, and she's not obligated to do this, and says, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. So she ends up following her mother-in-law back to Israel, where she is blessed and ends up getting to be a really cool part of the story later. So that's all happening in the midst of Judges. And you just see God providing for his people, but also inviting people from outside the Jewish community into experience his presence and his relationship with his people. So now you enter kind of part 2 of the Jewish story. So you have these judges, and the Israelite people decide, we don't love the judge setup. We want a king like all the other countries. Well, God was supposed to be their king, so he's in that moment rejected, but he does send a prophet, Samuel, to anoint a king for the Hebrew people. And the first king anointed's name is Saul. And Saul ends up looking great. He looks like a king. He plays the part well. But it ends up being a pretty sad story. So Saul ends up lying about God. God made many commands as a part of his law. And part of one of these is, if you get sent into this country and I tell you to kill everybody and leave no one alive, I mean it. Well, Saul kept someone alive when they went to battle and then lied about it. And it really displeases God. So God ends up sending Samuel to anoint the next king, and his name is David. And he's a shepherd boy. He's a lowly shepherd boy. And kind of in parallel, there's a battle going on with the Philistine people, one of the enemies of the Hebrew people. And there is a giant named Goliath. Well, everyone's afraid of Goliath, but David, this small shepherd boy who's been appointed the next king, ends up defeating Goliath with just a slingshot. And the people all worship the ground David walks on because of this. And Saul gets really, really jealous. So you start seeing the downward spiral of Saul, the first king, as he tries to kill David, who's already been anointed as the second king. Well, God is so displeased with Saul that eventually Saul dies. David steps in as the next king, and he's called a man after God's own heart. So David has a really intimate relationship with God, and we'll talk about that more when I get to the poetry section. But David's kingdom looks a lot different than Saul's does. And David ends up saying another really important covenant here is David asks God, I live in this beautiful palace. Can I build you a house for you to reside in that's also beautiful? And God says, no, your son is going to do that. And then he ends up kind of flipping it and saying, but I'm going to build a kingdom in the future that will last forever. So that's known as the Davidic covenant. It's also unconditional, meaning David doesn't have to do anything. But it's the first time we see, well, it's not the first time, but we also, again, God's sort of been instilling hope that, hey, none of you can fulfill this law that I've set out for you, but something is coming in the future, a kingdom that will last, that will fulfill all of these laws. So the Davidic covenant is saying, I'm going to build a house in the future, something great is coming, a kingdom and a king that will last forever. So David dies, his son becomes the next king, does build a temple for God, and Solomon is known as one of the wisest men in history. And he asked God for that wisdom, but he's really just wise in the ways of political matters, and he's also extremely wealthy. People from all over the world come to see his wealth and to hear his wisdom. But Solomon's downfall was that he intermarried. He had a ton of wives, and he intermarried with cultures that God said, hey, I'm not okay with this, because those cultures influenced him, and he ended up turning away from his one true God. He ended up worshiping all of the other gods as well. So God says, okay, I've had it. The kingdom of Israel, the Hebrew people, are going to split into two nations. I'm going to do that under your son. So Solomon dies, and then we're going to hit pause on the story before the kingdom splits, because I want to talk about the poetry section, because I think it's really cool about God. So the poetry section, just briefly, there are 5 books of poetry in the Bible. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. You have 2 subsections within these poetic books. The first one is sort of proverbial wisdom. And you've got Psalms, which David writes, and he writes a lot of these as he's under distress from Saul trying to kill him. And it's him crying out to God in 2 ways, hope and lament. And there are other authors within the Psalms, but the message is the same. They're crying out to God, and it shows how relational God is, how he wants to be a part of our lives, and desires to know our hearts, and he desires us to know his heart. Proverbs, Solomon wrote, wisest man, and it's just it's the norm. It's what is the norm. If you do this, generally this will happen. If you live a wise life, good things happen. The next subsection of poetic books is sort of, okay, you can recognize that the norm will happen if you live a wise life, but it won't always happen. That's just sort of a generalization, and there are exceptions to the rule. So Job is about a man who lived faithfully and lived a wise life, but everything gets taken from him. So you can recognize that essentially good things or bad things can happen to good people. And that story has so much redemption with what God does in Job's life at the end of the story, but more I can talk to you about that another time. Ecclesiastes, Solomon also writes, again, the wisest man in the world, and he says basically, you can have all the wisdom in the world, you can have all the wealth in the world, but none of that is enough if you don't have right relationship with God. Amazing message there. And then the last one, Song of Solomon, is such a cool book on marriage and sex, and basically saying, within marriage and sex, live a way that is not normal. Love harder, go deeper, serve, and go way above and beyond. Don't just do what is expected of you. So that's sort of the poetic part of the Old Testament, that David and Solomon write most of those books, and just show how relational God is and how much he cares about the day-to-days of our lives. Okay, so come back to the story. You have the first 3 kings, and now you've seen, sin in all of these kings, and God has said the kingdom is now going to split. So you see the kingdom split into 2 parts. You see 10 tribes in Israel, and you see 2 tribes in Judah. And you see a series of kings, and the rest of the books in the history section follow these series of kings as they lead the nation of Israel. Most of them are really, really bad. There are a couple of good ones in Judah, but going back to the Mosaic covenant where God says, if you obey me, I will bless you. If you disobey me, I won't. Eventually, the two kingdoms fall. Because all of the kings in Israel were bad, they fall first in 722 BC. Because there were some good kings in Judah, you see them fall second in 586 BC. But eventually they both fall. The northern kingdom, Israel, falls to Assyria, one of their enemies, and the southern kingdom falls much later to Babylon, two giant kingdoms of the day. So there's a couple things happening in the midst of all of this. You have the prophets, and the prophets are people designated by God to go tell the message of God to the people. And he's basically pointing back to that covenant saying, repent, obey, do what God has called you to do, and you'll be blessed. And that's consistent with throughout all of those prophets' message. But those prophets kind of show up in three different time periods. One is before the people get sent into exile or are defeated by Assyria and Babylon. So people are saying, hey, you are going to get defeated if you don't obey these laws. So those are the prophets that are pre-exile. Then you have some of the prophets that are during the exile. So while the people are in captivity, you have prophets still saying, hey, obey God, trust him, he's here, and his law still applies. And there's some really amazing stories there. And then you have, which we'll get to in a minute, post-exile. So the people are eventually freed, and you have prophets saying, hey, keep focusing on God, keep trusting in him. His ways are still good ways, and he wants what's best for you. And a really key covenant, the last covenant we'll talk about in the Old Testament, is found in the prophet Jeremiah's book. And God comes to Jeremiah and he says, hey, a new covenant is coming. So we've had several covenants that we've talked about in the Old Testament where God has made promises. In this one he says, there's a new covenant coming, and I'm going to be among my people again. So it's an amazing, amazing testament to what is coming and what God is going to do in the future, and a promise of something bigger coming that's going to fulfill the Mosaic covenant. So it's something that's going to live up to all the standards that are set in the Mosaic covenant. So you get through the exile, the people are, defeated, and eventually the king of Persia frees the people of Israel to go back to their homeland. So they are released from captivity. And you have a few last books of history. You have Ezra, who's sent back to Israel, and he decides he's going to rebuild the temple of God that Solomon built earlier, because that's been crushed in all these defeats. You have Nehemiah, an entire book about that, who fortifies the wall of Jerusalem, which is sort of like the capital of Israel. So they slowly start rebuilding the city. There is a group of people that stays essentially not in captivity, but in the land where they were held captive. And you have an entire book called Esther on how God is faithful to these people that have still not chosen to go back to their promised land. And that's one of my favorite books of the Bible. I'll have to tell you about it another time. Okay, so to quickly summarize, the Old Testament, you've seen sin enter the world. You've seen God promise Abraham land, people, and blessing. We've seen all those things and talked about those things. You saw the Mosaic covenant where God sets up the law for these people and says, if you obey me, you'll be blessed. If you don't, you'll be cursed. You see the Davidic covenant under David, King David, who says, hey, king is coming. There's a king coming, and it will last forever. And then lastly, you see the book of Jeremiah, the new covenant, that says there will be something in the future that fulfills these covenants. And so you end the Old Testament, and what you see are the Jewish people are sort of scattered. Some are back in their homeland. Some are still in captivity, sort of. But now I'm going to talk about what happens in between the Old and the New Testament in terms of history to kind of set up what happens in the New Testament. So we had Assyria and we had Babylon. Babylon ends up overtaking Assyria historically. So now all the people are sort of under captivity together in Babylon. Then you have Persia. Persia overtakes Babylon. You have the Persian kingdom. Then you have Alexander the Great of the Greek history, if you remember. He overtakes Persia. And in the Greek world, in the Greek Empire, suddenly you have people speaking one common language. They're all speaking Greek in that area. And you have roads being built. The world just gets really modernized under the Greek Empire. And then eventually you have the Roman Empire Herod the Great take over the Greek Empire. And now we're going to start the New Testament, which will go faster. But it's the most exciting part. It's sort of the climax of the story. So the New Testament, you're now under Roman rule, and you've seen a lot of modern development. Most people speak Greek. There's a lot of roads. Travel is easier. And the Jewish people have been dispersed, and so they've built synagogues in each of the cities they live in now instead of just their one temple. And so God is going to use all that in some really cool ways. So enter the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, and Gospel stands for good news. And each of those 4 books is about Jesus and his life, and they're just told from a slightly different lens to show a different side of who he is. So Jesus is born, and he's born of a virgin, and he's also in the line of David. So remember, David was promised a king in the future, and Jesus is literally in his bloodline. But his father is fully God. He is fully God, and he is fully man. So he's a man that walked this earth, but because he was born of a virgin, God is his father. So cool. And you see throughout his life, as he grows up, he lives the perfect life. He lives the life that literally no one else in the world in the history of mankind can live. He fulfills all of the laws that were spoken about in the Mosaic covenant. And he also fulfills all of the many prophecies that point towards him in the Old Testament. So there's lots of little things. He will be born in Bethlehem. Well, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. There's hundreds. So Jesus comes and he walks this earth. He calls disciples to follow him, and he preaches the message of good news. He says, I've come to make your relationship right with God. You've had to make sacrifices in the past. You're always sinning. You'll still sin, but because of what I'm going to do, you will be able to commune with God now through me. He speaks parables, so he teaches. He tells many stories that point to his truth throughout his life, and he lives the perfect life. He also simultaneously is calling out the Jewish leaders of the day of their hypocrisy. So he's seeing them be so focused on following the letter of the law that they're forgetting about the right relationship with God, and what God ultimately wants is the heart behind the actions. Jesus performs many miracles. He heals many, many people of various ailments. He even raises Lazarus from the dead. And he starts predicting that he's going to die. Well, his followers are thinking, this is the king that was promised to us thousands of years ago. He can't die. But what ends up happening is the Jewish people get so mad about his following, and that people are starting to change because of him, and that he is the new covenant. People are believing this is the new covenant. This man has come to seek and save those who were lost, and it's changing everything. The Jewish people end up having him crucified on a cross. So he dies a gruesome death on the cross. But then, 3 days later, he literally raises from the dead and defeats sin and death. So he lived a perfect life. He died on the cross. And he rose again, defeating sin and death so that we could have a relationship with God. So he was the perfect sacrifice that none of us could ever be. And he loved us so much that he himself did that, and God sent his very own son to do that for us. And so he appears to hundreds of people over those next 40-ish days so that people see and talk with him and eat with him. So it's proven he rose from the dead. There are various accounts of him. He literally rose from the dead. And so he ends up now moving on to sort of the history book, so Acts. He ends up ascending into heaven, but in doing so, he promises, hey, the Holy Spirit is coming. So a part of me is coming to live in you, which you've never had before. So, and I'm coming back. So we'll get to that in a second. So Jesus ascends into heaven after living a perfect life and raising from the dead, and promises the Holy Spirit. Well, in the book of Acts, we see the Holy Spirit come among the people and live among them, and then we see the gospel spread. So we see the early church, they've said, you know what, we believe this man, he is the Son of God, he's exactly who he says he was, and we want everybody to know it. We want everybody to believe in him so that they can also have right relationship with God and live eternal life with him. So you see the early church, and you see them start spreading the message of the good news from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and to the ends of the earth. You see a lot of persecution, so that makes the Roman Empire really mad. But you also see some really cool conversions. So Saul was a man who persecuted Christians, literally killed them. And God meets him on a road and says, you know what, I am who I say I am. And Saul, his name becomes Paul, and he ends up becoming one of the greatest missionaries ever, spreading the gospel and sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, saying, hey, I'm a sinner, I've done terrible things, but Jesus still loves me and died for me and rose again so that I could live in right relationship with him. And then you see 21 letters in the New Testament written by this early church, many of them written by Paul. And these letters are communicating the beliefs and the convictions of the early church. They're saying, here's what we believe about salvation. Here's what we believe about the Holy Spirit. Here's how we think we should act and live as believers, as people who have received this message of Jesus Christ. And so you see, and these are still the beliefs and convictions of the church today. So it's still what I believe. I study these books to understand, okay, this is how I should live or think about this. And those 21 letters are a really cool, consistent message of who God is and why he did what he did. And then the story ends with the book of Revelation. So this is the conclusion of the whole thing, and I love it because it's something that's going to happen in the future, but it's the end of the story. So Revelation is a prophetic book, and John writes this book, one of the disciples of Jesus, and it's essentially a vision of what's going to happen in the future. And the church has been persecuted heavily, and it's a picture of God coming back, Jesus coming back to earth in the same way he left. So he's going to come back, and he's going to ultimately defeat sin and death forever. So going all the way back to Genesis, when God says the serpent is going to bruise the heel of man, but the seed of man is going to crush his head. You see that in Revelation. You see Jesus is coming back, and he's going to kill sin and death ultimately and create a new heaven and a new earth where we can live in perfect peace with God like we were intended to in the Garden of Eden as the story opened. So there are a lot of parallels, but it's essentially a book of hope saying keep persevering, keep believing because I'm coming back. I'm not done yet. And all the sin and death and pain that you experience in the world, I'm going to come back and I'm going to defeat it. So keep living and staying true to the faith. So amazing message, a great end to the story, and just gives us so much hope as believers today. So that concludes the story of the Bible. So now I'm going to answer these 3 questions. So first question, the strongest part of the story of Scripture for me, or parts, were, well, there are several. So I loved the intertestamental history. So I loved knowing that God was moving in a time period where a lot of people think he was being silent. So between the Old Testament and the New Testament, a lot of people say, oh, God was silent for those 400 years. There were hundreds of years between the New and the Old Testament. But what the history of the day proves is that God was literally moving empires to build a way for his son to come and for his name to be spread faster than it ever could have been. So because everybody spoke a common language in the Greek world, and because there were roads, when Jesus was born, his name could be spread so much faster than it could have. So I love that. I love seeing the parallels between Genesis and Revelation and just seeing that God is true to his word. So the promises that he made in the Old Testament were fulfilled in Jesus, and that he's coming back. That just gives me so much hope. And then I loved a lot of things, but I'll conclude with this one. The poetry books, I had never seen them as being so important in showing how relational God was, even in the Old Testament. So now, as a believer who believes in sort of the New Testament and Jesus Christ, it's easy for me to think about, well, I get to have a relationship with God because of what Jesus did for me, fully by grace. I did nothing to earn that. But in the Old Testament, that's a little bit harder for me to wrap my head around because there were these laws that people couldn't live up, and the people had to do certain things. But the poetry books show, and Psalms specifically, that God really does desire a relationship with his people. He doesn't want us just doing the right thing. He wants us talking to him and trusting in him and believing in him, and sharing with him and spending time with him on a day-to-day basis. So that was really cool to study in the grand narrative. I had never looked at it that way. And then the parts of the story that I need to work on, well, there are probably a lot. I think getting a better idea of the prophets and just the order of how they fit into everything. I think that would be really helpful for me. And then specifically, I think tying a lot of the prophecies to Jesus would be helpful. So I know there's so many prophecies in the Old Testament, and many of them point to Christ. And the big ones we've talked about certainly do. But I think studying these more would even give more life to the gospel and help me explain it better. I also think the gospel itself, so because that's the easiest thing for me to accept and the thing I've known the longest in walking with the Lord, I think it was easy for me to lose sight of it in the grand narrative. So in putting it in the grand narrative like this, I think I could actually explain it better and highlight more its importance and just how much it means in the whole story of God. So I could probably do better at explaining the gospel. And then the story of Scripture differs from the story I would have told on the first day of class in a lot of ways. So I had never really put it together before that Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are the last history books that we have in the Old Testament, and just the actual order of the flow of events. So my version would have been a lot more sporadic and probably a lot more complicated than when you actually look at it as judges, and then kings, and then exile, and then all together as one again. And then fitting the prophets and the poetry within the history book, I think I would have tried to stretch that out a little bit more and viewed some of the prophets as more history books that extended out that history of the Old Testament. So that's a big thing that would have been different. I probably would not have focused as much on Genesis, but after taking the class, understand how much sin entering the world and the way that the curse played out impacts everything else that you see in the Bible. It affects why people can't live up to the Mosaic Code. It shows us, why we need Jesus, and that was God's plan from the get-go, and that He really wants right relationship with us. It also helped me understand that in all these moments when humanity is in its darkest state, God is constantly providing hope for His people and redeeming them and having mercy and grace when they don't deserve it. So I would have spent less time on Genesis, and the class really showed me that that's a really important book to set the stage. And I had very little understanding of Revelation before I took the class, and just truly seeing that as the conclusion to the story. So it was always the last book of the Bible to me, one that was hard to understand and interpret, but now seeing it as the end of the story that gives so much hope and encourages perseverance, it makes me see the whole story differently and makes me live my life differently now. So yeah, that's how I would answer those questions, and thanks so much for listening.